Welcome back, everyone. We have three speakers in our third session for today, and the session is titled "The Second Translation Movement," which is to say, the translation movement from Arabic to Latin, Hebrew, and other languages. We have three speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Dimitri Gutas, who's of course one of the leading experts in the field, who's joining us from Yale, where he's based as emeritus professor, and he will be speaking to us on the true translation periods under review, one in late antiquity and early Islam from Greek into Syriac and Arabic, and the second in the 12th to 14th century from Arabic into Latin and Hebrew. Over to you, Dimitri.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Ayman. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very sorry that I have not been able to participate in person and see all my dear colleagues, fellow travelers of the same road, and have been tilling the same field for all these years with most of you in the room. So I'm delighted to be even virtually with you. And thank you to the Furqan Foundation for the invitation and for making these arrangements. And also congratulations for the 35th anniversary of the Furqan Foundation in its important work. And I will be speaking today, about these translations, and I will try and give a more overall picture of the historical developments during what we have called the first and second translation movements, and try to see the connectedness that inspires them, and then give an example of exactly how these translations actually worked in the scholarly world, in the various communities into whose languages these works have been translated. Also, I see that, of course, the Furqan Foundation, in the brochure that you have for this meeting, the esteemed and rahimahullah, Ahmad Zaki Yamani, he founded this with the purpose of bridging the cultures East and West. And I will simply say that, well, this is, of course, a wonderful idea, and also it is a historical fact, in the sense that, as I will be trying to explain, the East and West of what is meant in that sense, East and West, has been bridged for basically hundreds of years, basically from Alexander onwards, as such. In a sense, what we have is in antiquity, we have Alexander goes all the way to Bactria, that is Afghanistan, establishing cities along the way named after him for the most part, including Kandahar, which is of course Iskandaria, plus of course the famous Iskandaria in Egypt. And in subsequent centuries, the Romans went westwards into the Atlantic Ocean, all the way into Gaul and Britain, of course, and Spain, so that by the first century BC, we have this entire geopolitical area from Central Asia to the Atlantic as one unified, as I said, geopolitical area and cultural whole as well. And it is into the peoples of these areas, all the way from Central Asia to the Atlantic, that ancient science was transmitted by means of translation and establishing basically the march of civilization in that sense. So translation had been the motor of civilization in a way. The peoples who participated in this endeavor have been always, of course, all the peoples in between, from Central Asia to the Atlantic. And the major languages in which the translations were made have been, of course, from Greek. We have to Persian, Middle Persian, and Syriac, and Arabic, and then Latin and Hebrew, to mention the major languages, and Greek, I should say, as well. That is medieval Greek as such. So the translations, historically, as they developed, constituted a kind of a relay, so to speak, from the beginnings in the 3rd, 4th century AD, all the way until the Renaissance. And the way the historical progression went was, we have until the 2nd century, after the Hellenistic age and the Roman Empire, the first 2 centuries, we have science being conducted in all these areas in Greek, basically. Not only in Greece proper, but also in the Middle East and North Africa. We have the sciences, and we have many names in philosophy and science. I should mention around the 3rd century of non-native Greek speakers who participate in the endeavor in Greek. For the 3rd century, we have the famous philosophers, Iamblichus, Porphyry, the student of Plotinus. Plotinus himself was an Egyptian Latin individual who eventually went and taught in Rome, but in Greek as well. As history progressed, and of course there's a long account for this, and I don't have the time to go into it, the need was felt, initially it would seem, in the Persian, the Sasanian Persians in the 3rd century, to translate the some of the sciences that were being circulating and studied into Middle Persian. And at the same time, it would see the Syriac scholars speaking in Syriac. They started translating the same ancient scientific tradition into Syriac. So that is the beginnings, I think. And then after that, we have, of course, with the coming of Islam, we have the translations into Arabic, which form a nodal point, and from then on, from Arabic, later on in the 11th and 12th centuries, later on into Latin and Hebrew as well. So the reasons why these communities felt the need to translate this are very interesting to see historically what they said themselves. And last year, I published and edited a volume called Why Translate Science, with the help of Charles Burnett and Uwe Weigelpohl. And Charles, I presume you are in the audience. Hello. We try to collect all the documents and about what was said about the translations and why each of those societies engaged in translation, what the reasons were that they thought it necessary to translate the sciences, and which makes a very fascinating reading about what it is. So we tried to cover as much ground as we could. And with the Sasanians, the beginning, which seems to be that once you have the Sasanians and they have as state ideology the refoundation of the ancient Persian Empire, they also thought of the idea that, of course, the sciences should go along with the foundation, and they came up with the idea that the sciences of the Greeks were actually Persian sciences, which Alexander, when he conquered Persia, he had those translated into Greek, and that's how we have the Greek sciences. So the Sasanians thought that by translating the Greek sciences back into Persian, retranslating, so to speak, that would be regaining their own tradition. This was the reason that was given in the Middle Persian sources about why translations started going. And this, of course, continued in all the other communities, as I said, in relay as it is. So in a sense, we have a continuous translation movement in relay all the way from the 3rd, 4th century, all the way to the Renaissance, which is really a fascinating story about that. Now, the details, of course, each one of us is studying in the individual talks that are being given. But to take a holistic picture, as an example, I will give the translation of one work, ancient work, and its transmission, translation and transmission. And this is the Poetics of Aristotle, which is actually a good example to follow, because it is it's a scientific work, in the sense it is literally a text about literature and the history and the criticism of literature, which, as part of the humanities, is of course a humanistic science as such, and it is possible to trace its transmission and translations and commentaries, and see how what these translations in relay, as I said, actually affected on the ground. So I have here now, where we are conducting a big project in Berlin with some colleagues, and we are engaged in this project of the Poetics from antiquity to the Renaissance, in editing and translating all those texts, which I will now discuss briefly, just to give an idea of what is going on. So if we can have, there is a chart that I have, a stemma of the transmission, which should be had, I hope each one of you has a handout that must have been delivered. If you do, that would be, if not, or if it can be projected on the screen, if it is at all possible for those. All right, you have it. Excellent. Thank you very much. So, so this chart, or perhaps stemma, is both a stemma of the transmission of manuscripts of this particular work of the Poetics, as well as the translations of them that they were. So we can start with the archetype manuscript, from which all the known manuscripts derive, which can be dated about to the 5th century AD, because strangely enough, with regard to the Poetics, from the time of Aristotle up until the 5th century AD, we don't really have any information about its whereabouts. There are very few citations of it or mentions of it as such, and it seems it was not really studied that much, if at all. But in the end, it did form part of the organon of Aristotle, of the logical works, as the last one of the 8 works. And as such, as part of the organon, was transmitted in the manuscripts, and we have that manuscript from which all the others, the extant ones, derive, and that is the Omega over there around the 5th century. Now, that manuscript, or a copy of it, what we call Sigma, capital Sigma in Greek, was translated into Syriac about in the 9th century sometime, and you can see it says the Syriac translation, and that translation was revised at some point. We have indications from the extant versions that there was a revision, and that revised Syriac translation was translated into Arabic by Abu Bishr Mata ibn Yunus before 932, as such, beginning of the 10th century sometime. And that is the translation, the Arabic translation that is extant, in the famous Paris manuscript, Arab 2346. Magnificent document, which can be seen online. Thank God for the French Bibliothèque Nationale. They saw it proper to put it on their site, so one can have access to it. And it says that you can have a look at it. It's Paris Arab 2346. Now, that's a translation by Abu Bishr Matta ibn Yunus. Now, this translation was revised at one point, and it was that revised edition that we have in the Paris manuscript 2346. The same first Arabic revision was accessible then later on into Ibn Rushd in the 12th century, to Averroes, who commented on it. But before that, we have this first Arabic revision being available to Avicenna, to Ibn Sina, but he also used another revised version, a second revised version. And we know this because in some places where the extant text that we have from Abu Bishr is wrong, Ibn Sina has the right text if he gets it, so he gets it in a corrected revision that he has. And Ibn Sina writes his magnificent commentary as part of the Shifa, his great work. Again, at the end of the section on logic, as the eighth part, as the ninth part actually of logic, as such. Ibn Rushd uses, of course, the first revised translation that he has, but he also uses Ibn Sina in places where he cannot really understand the translation very well, and he uses Ibn Sina's interpretation as such. To continue on the oriental side, so to speak, of the story, Ibn Sina himself, his work from the Shifa was used very much in the 13th century by two scholars, one in Syriac by Bar Hebreus Ibn al-Ibri, as part of his also a great work which copies the Shifa in a sense for a great extent. So we have Ibn Sina's commentary then partly translated, partly paraphrased by Ibn al-Ibri, who may have had also another source. We don't really know, perhaps the original Syriac translation. It is not clear. And also using Ibn Sina's commentary in the Shifa, the great Tusi, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, paraphrases and abridges this into Persian. And so we have a Persian version of the Shifa commentary as such. On the west side, we have, as I said, Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. And very shortly after Ibn Rushd, his student, presumably one of his students, Ibn Tumlus, writes another paraphrastic commentary using Ibn Rushd and the Arabic translation. But most importantly then, the following century then, in the 13th, we have the translation of Ibn Rushd's commentary into Latin by the great Hermanus Alemanus, Herman the German, into Latin. And soon thereafter, the translation again of Ibn Rushd's commentary into Hebrew by Todrosi. So then, at this time, we have it transmitted throughout these languages. The commentaries, well, the text of, not the text of Aristotle himself, but the commentaries. And there is a final coda, and that is Todrosi's Hebrew version in the Renaissance, in the 15th century. It gets translated back into Latin from Hebrew by Jacob Mantino and by Abraham de Balmes, two physicians working in northern Italy and such. They apparently did not know of the Latin translation of Herman the German, so they translated the Hebrew into Latin, and one separately, distinctly from each other, although they were roughly contemporaries as such. But nevertheless, there it is. So we have then here the trajectory, the entire trip, the journey of the Poetics of Aristotle, and the commenting about it continuously, as I said, from the 6th, 8th century onwards, and all the ideas being disseminated. And now the interesting thing, of course, is how this translation was understood and used in each linguistic community as time goes by. So we can trace basically the development of this science, of literary science, so to speak, in these communities by means of these translations. And also it shows the interconnectedness of this endeavor. It wasn't, it certainly in each stage of the relay, they were aware of the previous stages as such, of course, and used them to proceed forward. So as I said, we have a continuous translation movement from these centuries, from the 8th century onwards until the Renaissance. And therefore, East and West form actually one unified whole already before that, in which they participated in these activities, so that by the 15th century, we could have a scholar from, let's say, from Bukhara and a scholar from Paris or Cambridge talk to each other basically on the same terms, because they all had read the same texts and commentaries on ancient science as each one, and they could really discuss these things very much on the same level. Because this kind of transmission is not, of course, for the Poetics. This is almost exactly the same for all the other ancient scientific works. Certainly Aristotle, Galen, all the medical, etc., all these works. And it would be wonderful if we can have such projects for each one of those works. Well, doing the metaphysics of Aristotle or the physics obviously would be a huge undertaking, because there were so many more commentaries and translations, etc., stages in that. But still, this gives you an idea of the both the transmission itself and the extent of it and the continuity of it as such. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think, yeah, in 25 minutes, that's right.
So as I said, we'll have the three papers and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So our next speaker is Professor Efthymios Nicolaidis, who will be presenting on the transmission of Islamic astronomy in the Byzantine Empire, authorities and texts. Efthymios, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you for the invitation. I thank also the foundation for this beautiful symposium. I'm very, very sorry not to be there. I'm one of these old-fashioned people that do not like online meetings. I think that personal relations are very, very important in meetings and also in university courses. With some colleagues, we say that it would be a very nice idea also to organize, for example, conferences without presentation, just to meet people and to talk together. So I will present you an overview. Of course, it is an overview, and very raw overview of the transmission and the translations and the translators of astronomical text from the Islamic world to Byzantium. Unfortunately, we have not many new data and studies the last years. The main, the soul of the study of Byzantine astronomy is the Professor Antillon in Belgium, Antillon has initiated a team in order to study Greek Byzantine manuscripts on astronomical manuscripts. Unfortunately, it is very difficult in our days to find PhD students in order to work about editing a text. You know, to edit a text is a very long, a very difficult process. It does not lead to many publications. You have only one big publication. It is very difficult to make tens of publications of it. And it needs skills, many skills, you know, language, paleography, to understand the text, or to understand mathematics, mathematical astronomy, etc. It is why maybe the last 10 years, we have not many new things about Byzantine astronomy, and it is a pity. So the point of view I will present you, I am not like Professor Gutas, of course, a specialist of Arabic science. The point of view I'll present you is the point of view from the Greek translation, from the Greek text. What we call them from the Byzantine astronomical text. So we can divide. There is, of course, there is an important movement of transmission of text and knowledge from Islam to Byzantium. And this movement, we can divide it in three main periods. So the first period, the first one, it is important to say that it takes place at the same time of the birth of Arabic astronomy. So it's a movement which takes place at the end of the 8th century. How we can say that? We can say that because we have three texts from in Greek from a certain Stephanus the astronomer. And this Stephanus the astronomer, in one of his three texts, he says, I am coming back from Persia. He is identified in two of these texts, and another one written by Stephanus of Alexandria. Actually, it was not Stephanus of Alexandria. It was this Stephanus. Presents the horoscope of Islam at the text is dated, falsely dated, the year 625. But in fact, this text is of this Stephanus. He produced the other two texts, and it was written in 7075. Why we do know this? It's clear. There are predictions. You know, the Byzantines at that period were very anxious about Islam because of the wars and of the advance of Islam towards the Byzantine lands. So they would like to see the future. So the predictions are, the text is falsely dated, I say, 625. All the predictions until 1775 are absolutely accurate. And all the predictions after this date are absolutely false. So Stephanus predated this horoscope in order to convince Byzantine people in Constantinople that astrology can say the future. And why he does this? We can understand this from his other two texts. He says that astronomy is a very important science, But unfortunately, astrologers are not welcome in Constantinople, and they should be welcome because it's an important sign. So he advertised his job, if I can say, by this false manuscript. We have a small technical problem about the other two texts, because Stephanus, he uses some Arab science, Arab astronomy numbers, Arab astronomical constants. And at one point of the text, he says that the sun has a shift from Ptolemaic tables of 5 degrees. This is of course, these 5 degrees are to be found in all Arab texts, but later, not at this period. So this is a problem. Maybe these 5 degrees were added later. Maybe this one text is not from Stephanus. It is a problem that we must investigate. Anyway, the main thing is that already from the end of the 8th century, there are transmissions, I would say, not translation, transmission from Arab astronomy to Byzantine. It was the period that Byzantine astrologers too and astronomers went work to the Arab lands. For example, we have Theophilus of Edessa, who worked also as astrologer in the Islamic world. So we have a movement in both sides. This is the first part. This is the first period. The second period, we have a very nice manuscript of Almagest from the 9th century. And in this manuscript, some hand has written later some scholia at this manuscript. And these scholia are dated about the beginning of the 11th century. In all the scholia, we must note that there are Arab astronomical knowledge, so Arabic constants, which are different from those of Ptolemy. And at the same time, which is very interesting, is that already we can see some terms, some Arabic terms, that have been Hellenized. So the idea is that, if you have Hellenized terms, that means that these texts are not very new, because in order to Hellenize the terms, you need some time, some contact, some process. And the conclusion we can make from this Hellenized term is that these texts are not very new, that there exists finally from Stephanus to the 11th century chain of last texts transmitting Arabic astronomy or Islamic astronomy. I would say Islamic, but because some is also from Persia, Islamic astronomy to the Byzantine world. So this second period, I would like also to say that the main astronomer who is behind this transmission of the second period is Ibn al-Alam. in Greek, in the Greek texts, they say the tables of Alim, but the colleagues who are specialists about Islamic astronomy have identified this Alim with Ibn al-Alam, who died at 985 of our dating, okay? So this is the second, but this is the second period, but this period will, as we will see, will be a large period. Transmission will never stop from then and onwards. We have other important texts, and these texts, these tables of Alam, of Al-Alam, are used for at least 150 years in Byzantium. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because 150 years later, John Synodinos, we have not identified this person, has an horoscope made for him, and this horoscope is based exactly on the same sources than the sources I mentioned before. At the end of the century, we have also the important finding of the Byzantine astrolabe, the only Byzantine astrolabe preserved entirely, and which is at the Brescian Museum in Italy. And this astrolabe is Byzantine, but at the same time, it's absolutely influenced by Islamic astrolabes. It is made for a certain Serios. This Serios was from Syria. And one can really identify this astrolabe with the Arabic skills of making astrolabes of those times. So there is a whole movement with crafts, astrolabes, with texts, and also with tables, astronomical tables. So we, at the end of this period, this period was called, and I see it's still called by the Byzantinists, the first Byzantine humanism, when Byzantines, they study again ancient Greek texts, but at the same time, they study also the Arabic text. There is something ideological here I would like to present. In the other astronomical Byzantine texts of this period, we can see a certain prejudice against Islam. The Byzantines, from then and even later, they say in their text that our tradition is the tradition of Ptolemy. We have the knowledge of Ptolemy, the ancients, etc., etc. And the others, Islam, are the unbelievers. So why this sort of debate? Why do we must accept the science of the unbelievers? Okay, behind this is all this ideological Orthodox Byzantine tradition. But at the same time, Islamic astrology is extremely welcome. We are at the time of the Komneni, the emperors, who love astrology, although the condemnations of from the Orthodox Church, very clear condemnations about astrology. We have the texts of Gregory of Nyssa firmly condemning astrology. But at the same time, the emperors, they use astrologers in their milieu, and they are very happy to have the knowledge of Islam for this. I will mention also the polymath Seth, who was at the court of the Comneni, and who also has left us some texts, some astronomical texts of tables of stars, which can be clearly identified with Islamic tables of stars. And one of these tables, his source is a table of star of Abu Mashar, and Simeon Seth, he completes this table of Abu Mashar. So we have on one hand this, prejudice against Islamic science, and on the other hand, Islamic science really enters the Byzantine world. It is also the period that a very, very important manuscript presents a whole corpus of Islamic science. This manuscript is the Vaticanus Graecus 1056 of the 12th century. And it is in this manuscript we find a whole corpus of Islamic astronomy, list of stars, horoscopes, methods in order to construct tables themselves. The tradition is from the book Zir al-Hakimi of Ibn Yunus. So it's a tradition which is not so old, okay? The period is almost the same, which demonstrates that this knowledge is transmitted very fast to Byzantine. Maybe, because in this text also, we have a lot of Hellenized terms, and behind this text, there is, without any doubt, a tradition and many other texts that have not survived. This is only a small part of a whole mountain, I can say, of Islamic astronomy that had penetrated already the Byzantine world. The third, because I check the time, okay. The last period is the most important. It is the most important for the researchers because it is a period where we have many texts. And it is the end of the final period of Byzantium. After the reconquer of Constantinople from the Crusaders, the story is well known. I will not repeat it. I'll say just a few words to make the context. We have this famous travel of Chioniades at the very beginning of the 40th century to Persia, to Malaga and Tabriz. Chioniades goes there because he knows that the state-of-the-art astronomy is taught in Tabriz. So he goes there in order to find this knowledge. He makes many travels from Trebizond to Tabriz. He's also named later as bishop, Orthodox bishop in Tabriz. And from all his travels, he first he becomes there a pupil in order to study astronomy, and he a pupil of excuse me, I must say it, a pupil of Shams al-Din al-Bukhari, astronomer and polymath. And from his travels, he brings back to Byzantium the whole corpus of the Persian astronomy of Malaga of this time, of his time. It is of interest to say that when Ioanniadis brought back this corpus, it was not transmitted directly to the Byzantine world. It was not Ioanniadis who transmitted all this corpus. This corpus went through two people before it be translated and transmitted to Byzantium. First, to a certain Manuel, a priest of Trebizond, who used the Persian astronomical tables to write the horoscope of Trebizond of the year 336. And after him, probably his pupil, it was his pupil, George Chrysokokis, who translated and adapted all the corpus in Greek in order to transmit it in Byzantium. This Persian corpus is the most important for Byzantine astronomy because the Persian astronomical tables became so famous. About 50 manuscripts survive until our days. So imagine the number of the manuscripts that in which this corpus was diffused in the Byzantine times of this period. And from this corpus and on, we have many Persian influenced manuscripts. You see, all my talk is not about a certain very precise translation of one text, of one Arabic text to Byzantium. The transmission is much more complex in astronomy. The transmission was not made by simply translate a text or two texts. It was by adapting some texts, whole corpus of texts, into Greek, and also adapt. There's not only the language in order to make tables. This is also you have to adapt the latitude. So there are many adaptations to make. So this is the transmission which is of course direct, but not exactly direct. There are compilations of texts more than really translations of texts. And this last compilation includes the main Persian astronomical tables and all the tradition of Al-Tusi. There is the history of the transmission of the Persian astronomy astronomy to the West goes through these Byzantine texts. I'll not exactly repeat, but I only mention the theory of our colleagues Sverdlov many years ago about the transmission of the famous mathematical tool Altus couple to Copernicus. And the idea is that this mathematical tool that Copernicus used in order to construct his theory of the movement of Mercury, this mathematical tool was found by Copernicus when he traveled to Italy in a text translated from Persian by Honiadis, and which was founded in the Vatican Library. So at this last period, where the astronomical tables of Islam, and especially for Persia, became a great fashion in Byzantium, there is also a debate. There is a debate between the Arabic and more especially Persian astronomy towards the tradition of the astronomy of Ptolemy.
So, Professor Nicolaidis, yellow card, 2 minutes, please.
I'm finishing. I'm finishing. And this debate finally ended maybe with the transmission of Persian astronomy, because the Persian astronomical tables were much more easy to use than the Ptolemaic ones. We have colleagues, our colleague Raymond Mercier, who is also a mathematician, a very good mathematician. He made some comparisons, and maybe the astronomical tables of Persia, they were not so well adapted, so they have many mistakes, but they were very easy to use. It's why this transmission was so successful at the end of the Byzantine period. Thank you very much. I was, I think, on time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you're absolutely on time. Thank you very much. So our third and final speaker is Maryam Patton, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard, and whose paper is titled Ottoman Chronology, Western Readers, the Italian translation of Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm al-Abdan. Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ. I'm sorry, thinking of another book.
It's truly an honor to be here, and I would like to thank Al-Furqan Foundation for organizing and hosting such a lovely event on the theme of translation between East and West. Today, I will be discussing a particular moment in translation that is relevant for the study of Enlightenment Europe and its relationship with the Ottoman Empire. Unlike the medieval translation movements we heard discussed earlier today by my distinguished colleagues, the scattered translations that appeared during the late 17th and 18th centuries from Turkish, Arabic, and Persian into European languages such as Italian, French, and Latin are not seen as constituting a kind of translation movement per se. While part of the reason for this lies in the difference in the sheer quantity and scale of translations when contrasted with their medieval counterparts, another reason has to do, I believe, with shifting ideas regarding the purpose of translation. The main figures who come to mind when we think of translations between Ottoman and European languages were individuals known as dragomans, an anglicized term for the Arabic word tarjuman, which meant translator. And historically, dragomans who worked for the Ottoman Empire or with the Ottoman Empire served in a political capacity. They either worked along popular trade and news routes and were known as road dragomans, or they stayed assigned to a specific city such as Venice or Istanbul, and could also be assigned to a specific diplomat for the duration of that individual's tenure in the role, whom they would then accompany during any context that might require translation. Some dragomans, like the subject of my talk today, Gian Rinaldo Carli, came from distinguished families of dragomans who effectively operate a kind of monopoly with well-defined networks of influence and access. In recent years, more and more scholars have studied dragomans and their social networks to demonstrate the important role they played in brokering empire, facilitating exchange, and influencing Ottoman and European perceptions of each other. And yet, despite the fact that the linguistic skills of dragomans likely rivaled their humanist counterparts of the 16th century, who often struggled to find local intermediaries who could teach them Oriental languages or who could help with translating Arabic or Turkish texts, dragomans did not typically produce scholarly translations. This, I believe, has to do with the idea that a dragoman acted as a kind of neutral intermediary within diplomatic and political contexts, and that translations performed within this capacity, such as of imperial edicts or firmans, represented a different kind of translation when compared to the scientific texts of the previous translation movements. My concern in the present paper is not to debate what constituted a translation movement, or to explore why dragomans in the 16th and 17th centuries did not publish translations of scientific or literary works. Rather, I would like to focus on the work of one dragoman in particular, of the late 17th century, Gian Rinaldo Carli, whose efforts to translate an Ottoman historical almanac by Kātip Çelebi demonstrate a shift in European attitudes towards studying the Ottomans that, I believe, was characteristic of the Enlightenment as a whole and reflects changes in attitudes towards translation more generally. Whereas throughout the early modern period, European book markets were saturated with texts about the Turks, their culture, their customs, religious rites, the organization of their state and armies, etc., hardly any of these writers described Ottoman literary, scholarly, or scientific output. Even those relatively neutral accounts, European accounts of Ottoman culture that were not overtly polemical, were ultimately mediated accounts told through European eyes. By the late 17th century, however, the authority of the classical tradition and attitudes towards studying foreign cultures began to shift, and the translation efforts of Gian Rinaldo Carli and others demonstrate that more and more European scholars were interested in reading the Ottomans on their own terms, through translations of complete texts that had minimal intervention on the part of the translator. Gian Rinaldo Carli's translation thus represents the initial stirrings of an Enlightenment interest in other cultures, not as mirrors that reflected the superiority or greatness of Christendom or served as ethnographic case studies, but rather as inherently valuable sources in and of themselves. This then brings me to Gian Rinaldo Carli and his translation of Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ. As I mentioned briefly, Carli belonged to a broader family network of dragomans who intermarried among themselves as well as among the Catholic Istanbul's elite families to fortify their influence as colonial Venetian subjects. A series of oil paintings commissioned by the Tarsiya and Carli dragoman dynasties, one of which I have demonstrated here, celebrated these Venetian families and bolstered their sense of status, wealth, and glory. As Natalie Rothman and Stefan Hans have recently demonstrated, the dragoman renaissance, of which Carli was a member, represented an active effort of self-fashioning as subjects of a Venetian imperial service. For the remainder of my talk, I wish to focus on a specific work of translation by Carli, which in fact set him apart from this larger world of inter-dragoman politicking, because it represents not only one of the first examples of a European translation of a complete Ottoman work, but also the only Venetian dragoman's translation of an Ottoman work to be printed. That work, which Carli entitled the Chronology Historica, and which he published in Venice in 1697, was a translation of a Turkish historical text by Kātip Çelebi penned about 50 years prior and entitled Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ. Kātip Çelebi, or Hacı Khalifa as he's better known in the West, was one of the great polymaths of Ottoman intellectual history, and it is beyond the scope of this paper to fully examine his significance within Ottoman letters more generally. He was extremely prolific and penned books and treatises on a wide variety of subjects, and within the context of European scholarship, it is not this translation of Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ by Carli for which he is known, but rather his vast bibliographical dictionary of nearly 15,000 books, similar in concept to Ibn Nadim's Fihrist, which we heard about earlier today, entitled Keshf-i Zunun. This Arabic text was translated into French by Barthélemy d'Herbelot and Antoine Galland, and published in 1697, only a few months later than Carli's brief but less famous work, Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ. The nature of the title Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ, which I would conservatively render as Almanac of Chronologies or Almanac of Histories, offers clues to its structure and nature as a historical work. Although today the word Taḳvīm is almost synonymous with calendar, its original meaning denoted a tabular representation of information, and its Arabic root had more of a spatial meaning related to the idea of standing up, erecting, or raising. Similarly, Tārīḥ, in the sense of history, developed from its original meaning for the dating of events in a chronological sense. The bulk of Kātip Çelebi's text constituted tables, or lists depending on the specific manuscript under discussion, of all the events of world history dating from the beginning of creation until Kātip Çelebi's own time. In his introduction, Kātip Çelebi explained that his goal was to reconcile various contradictory historical frameworks, principally as it related to the dating of events according to various calendars. He then offers a brief overview of the mechanics of calendar dating and the difficulty of reconciling calendar traditions, as well as an explanation of the origins and use of 6 calendars relevant to his text, including the Turkic animal calendar, the Coptic, the Rumi, the Hijri, the Persian Yazdegerd, and the Selçuk Celali calendars. Then the text proper begins, with the fall of Adam in year 1. ül-Tevārīḥ was written in a mixture of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, as noted by Carly on his own title page, perhaps as a boast of his linguistic abilities. But aside from the prefatory and concluding sections, it is actually rather devoid of analysis, rhetoric, or even narration. Events are stated in a plain style, such and such thing happened in such and such year, and at least for the events that preceded the advent of Islam, they are dated according to the amount of time that has passed from the fall of Adam in year 1 to the start of the Hijri calendar. So it starts over, basically, when we get to Hijri year 0. In 6,216 years later, from the fall of Adam. Events from pre-Islamic era are grouped according to empires and dynasts, and towards the end, reference tables organizing lists of caliphs and the regnal years of kings convey an encyclopedic view of world history. Like Keşf-i Zunun, then, ül-Tevārīḥ was, in effect, a reference work, and not a narrative history, like those written by Kātip Çelebi's peers, such as Peçevi. Later scholars, such as Şemdani-Zade Süleyman, even expanded on the chronological structure of ül-Tevārīḥ and turned it back into a narrative. But on the whole, this work was still rather popular in Ottoman contexts, but as a reference. The fact that Carly's translation into Italian was actually just the first of 3 translations into European languages, including later ones into French and Latin, speaks to its appeal in the West. I will now explore possible reasons for this appeal and what it suggests for Enlightenment scholarship as a whole. Although Carly's translation of ül-Tevārīḥ was his first and only single-authored publication, it was not the first time he dabbled in translating something from Turkish into Italian for publication. A decade prior, in 1688, the former Venetian bailo to the Sublime Porte, Giovanni Battista Donato, published a small duodecimo booklet after his return from Istanbul in 1684, which he entitled Della Letteratura dei Turchi. The book is a survey of Ottoman studies in the fields of grammar, poetry, logic, mathematics, geometry, medicine, history, and many others. The bailo Donato knew very little Turkish, and so Carly was likely far more involved with aiding him in this translation project than Donato's scattered acknowledgments throughout would suggest. In the introduction to Della Letteratura dei Turchi, Donato explains how, quote, "Of the vast empire of the Turks, many have described the countries, nations, and customs. The curiosity of French writers, surpassing Italians and Germans with meticulous diligence, portrayed all the sects of their religion, both sacred and profane ceremonies, the differences in clothing for both women and men, the orders and positions, both civilian and military, and the various and different insignias, for which for the most part consist in the varied and different forms of their caps and turbans. However, little or no information has been disseminated in Europe about the studies and literature of the Turks up to now." This booklet, Donato hoped, would help rectify the matter, and he proceeded subject by subject describing some of the major authors and books in various arts and sciences, but in rather superficial detail. He would typically just give an author and the general summary of what the book was about. And after some translation of Proverbs, where Carly's assistance is acknowledged, the booklet concludes with an exhortation for additional translations of books from Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. The first to answer that call would be Carly, 9 years later, in 1697. Like Donato, one of Carly's stated aims was to dispel the notion that the Turks were ignorant of erudition. His preface to the reader begins, quote, "Deceived by a false apprehension, many wanted to believe that the Turks did not engage in serious studies of history or the pleasures of fine literature." I should note here the emphasis that Carli placed first on serious studies of history, which contrasts with Donato's more general category of literature. Further in the preface, Carli notes that it was Donato's booklet, which Carli had helped prepare, that inspired him to test the veracity of Donato's claims. His chosen method, though he offers no clear explanation why, was to translate Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ from start to finish. As I noted earlier, Carli's translation of Kātip Çelebi represented one of the earliest examples of a European translation of a complete Ottoman text, and while I do believe we ought to take Carli's claim that he simply wished to demonstrate the learnedness of Ottoman scholarship at face value, I would also posit that Carli wished to present Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ as a potentially useful text for scholars seeking to expand their source base for historical chronology. Carli demonstrated this impulse most clearly in his preface, where he went on to discuss the chronology of the age of the earth, and noted the fact that Kātip Çelebi's calculations might draw the attention of scholars with doubts as to the truth of his history. Carli noted how Kātip Çelebi's calculation for the amount of time between the fall of Adam and the start of the Hijri calendar was 6,216 years, which would mean the earth was 7,274 years old by the time Kātip Çelebi was writing in 1648. This, Carli explains, deviates from the more commonly accepted age of the earth of 5,617 years, rendering a difference of 1,657 years. But rather than explain away Kātip Çelebi's calculation as, an error of the Ottomans, Carli goes on to demonstrate, using this table, that, quote, "I do not believe, however, that this difference can discredit the author's epitome, as even among our accredited and saintly authors, there are so many varieties that do not lead to confusion, and in particular it is seen that this computation calculated by Khalifa is close to the calculation of many of ours." A table illustrating the variety of the age of the earth calculations among various authors further emphasizes Carli's ultimate point, which is that Kātip Çelebi's work merits just as serious an evaluation as the commonly accepted Western authors. The matter of the age of the earth was one of the major intellectual debates of the 16th and 17th centuries, especially among humanists interested in reconciling chronology. The last name to appear in Carli's table here, Joseph Scaliger, was among the most influential figures in the development of professional chronology, and one of the reasons Scaliger's efforts were taken so seriously was his careful utilization of astronomical data, together with historical chronology, to posit what he believed was the most accurate timeline for the history of mankind and biblical events. Indeed, early modern European historians and astronomers were often working towards the same goal, and I believe part of why Kātip Çelebi's work appealed to Carli was Çelebi's careful attention to matters of calendars and defining years, months, and days on astronomical grounds, which all served to further illustrate that an Ottoman chronological work such as Taḳvīm ül-Tevārīḥ could find easy reception among European audiences in spite of the differences in chronological calculations. As further justification, Carli noted that Kātip Çelebi's text must be taken seriously because, quote, "he demonstrates quite clearly how much knowledge he has of astronomical and cosmographic matters." This interest in the astronomical merits of Kātip Çelebi's history also offers an interesting angle to explore the broader Ottoman context in which Kātip Çelebi produced his text. Some of the theories posited as to why Carli chose this text by Kātip Çelebi suggests it was because of its supposedly novel objective and unadorned style when compared with other Ottoman histories from the 17th century. Somewhat ironically, however, Kātip Çelebi was not coining a new form of historical scholarship. In fact, he was reviving an older model of chronological histories that also called themselves Taḳvīm, and which were usually prepared by astrologers and placed in the first few pages of annual astrological almanacs. This slide illustrates one particularly lovely example of an anonymous Taḳvīm from 1433, currently preserved at the Chester Beatty Library. These historical almanacs were also known for listing events in a plain, unadorned style, and of dating their events according to how many years had passed since the event in question. But they gradually disappeared by the end of the 15th century, however. And one theory suggests that this reflected shifting tastes in the Ottoman court and a growing preference for detailed narrative historians who wrote in a high Ottoman-registered punctuated by poetry and especially Persianate and Arabic influences. So it seems rather ironic that if Karli's interest in Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm stemmed from his perception that Kātip Çelebi was more objective or rational in his presentation of history, that he chose an author who was making a deliberate throwback to an older genre of Ottoman astrological almanacs. Karli was likely ignorant of this background to Kātip Çelebi's text, however, and I believe that his selection of this text in particular was just as likely due to the simple fact that Donato, the author of the earlier booklet about Turkish literature, happened to own this book. That should not, however, discredit the genuineness of Karli's interest in Kātip Çelebi, even if he did not pick his text out in particular from, say, a broader corpus. Let us return now to Karli's Italian translation, which on the whole was a close and faithful translation of Kātip Çelebi's words. I was struck by a comment that Charles Burnett made earlier today about how the translators of the medieval period did not identify themselves or claim authorship, and I think it is worth reflecting on how a dragoman like Karli might have thought of himself as an author in the context of the age of print. Another way that Karli demonstrated his goal of showing that the Ottomans were erudite was through the use of printed marginal annotations. Some of the most interesting of his annotations were those that pointed out whenever Kātip Çelebi diverged from accepted Western chronology, but which he explained was due to the sources that Kātip Çelebi relied on. In this section here regarding the events around 3,800 years since the fall of Adam, for example, which describe the moment when Prophet Moses was born and when he met with the figure Hızır, one of Karli's notes states how, quote, "In this whole account, one observes many differences in terms of names and time compared to what is written in the Holy Scriptures and by Josephus, but it must be believed that the author has drawn it from Arab and Persian historians." What I hope to emphasize here is that Karli defends Kātip Çelebi's methods of chronology, since he has already demonstrated his skill in calendrical computation, and he suggests that any chronological fault lies not with Kātip Çelebi, but with his sources. One way to interpret this annotation is to suggest that Karli is gradually leading readers, ultimately, towards the Enlightenment debate between the ancients and the moderns that ultimately freed Enlightenment thinkers from their overdependence on classical authors. Elsewhere in this translation, however, Karli points out divergences from the Greek and Latin authors. He also pointed out those passages that agreed as well, however, and added the names of respective Greek and Roman authorities. Karli thus, in a way, set out to incorporate Kātip Çelebi's chronology within a broader humanist tradition of reconciling, comparing, and synchronizing sources from classical antiquity. We can interpret Karli either as occupying the tail end of the humanistic tradition and its veneration for classical antiquity, or as signaling the earliest stirrings of the Enlightenment with its greater affinity for non-Western sources and a willingness to let go of its veneration of the classical past. In either case, Karli's use of annotations to visibly and clearly delineate his voice from Kātip Çelebi's words allowed the text to speak for itself, while still subtly acknowledging his presence. In his role as a dragoman, Karli's voice and words would have typically stood in place of the subject of his translation, intervening and effectively replacing them. In this translation of Kātip Çelebi's Taḳvīm, Karli's role as interlocutor was fairly limited to the preface and to the brief comments in the margins. These marginalia should not be interpreted purely as philological critiques, but rather as a form of paratextual apparatus that rendered Kātip Çelebi's work into a format familiar to late Renaissance scholars. The significance of his selecting a work such as Taḳvīm was with its rather sterile tables of events and rulers, rather than a flowery narrative with more detailed analysis, lay not in some modern anachronistic ideal of the rational objectivity of the Enlightenment thinkers, but rather with the enduring importance of chronology, which the early modern scholars believed, and during a period when the great abundance of calendrical traditions and sources from around the world suddenly threw the accepted narrative into disarray. Karli's translation of Kātip Çelebi was thus a notable effort in several respects, and not just because it marked a rare example of a dragoman publishing a translation. It was one of the first instances of an Ottoman work being translated for a European audience in full, and I believe it illustrated this shifting attitude from simply writing about the Ottomans to using translation to allow the Ottomans to speak for themselves. I believe the fact that Karli chose a work by a relatively contemporary Ottoman is rather significant in this regard, and it should invite us to reflect on the role translation can have, not just to preserve the past, but to understand one's neighbors in the present. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let me start by asking one small question about the last presentation. So there's in one slide you showed a quotation, and there's the word jokes, which yeah. I mean, it seems to be a minor point, but it's sort of quite telling. So I assume this is a translation of nukat?
No, scherzi. No? I put the Italian word there.
Okay, but what's joke? Is ultimately is he referring to something that Kātip Çelebi said in his text? And is it the word nukat?
So
what is
That's what I actually set out to explore when I first. Oh, thank you. Thank you for this question. I was debating whether to leave that quote in. It's like, oh, someone's going to ask about jokes. Oh boy. I did not find the obvious, a clear case of Carly translating whatever he meant by jokes. And I think this has to do with us not knowing what manuscript Carly was working from. Because in the various Kātip Çelebi manuscripts I've looked at of this text, some have marginal annotations outside of the bounds of the lists of events. And I think this is what Carly's referring to, like an author commenting on some event in a text, but he didn't include them in the book. And so I'm still figuring out, I think maybe my translation of jokes is not accurate, and I have to figure out, I plan to research this further.
Okay.
But that was one of the first things that drew me into studying this topic. And in the end, I was like, wait, what jokes is he referring to?
Because presumably there aren't any jokes.
There aren't any jokes. I know, exactly. So,
okay.
But the Italian word is scherzi in plural, which does mean jokes. So I invite anyone who knows more Italian philology than me to comment. Maybe there's another way of interpreting
Peter,
it.
Are you going to comment on? Not on this, not on jokes. Okay. Oh, right. So that's interesting. So you have comment to make? Yes, please.
ليس لدي تعليق وإنما لي شرح لكلمة ترجمان. هكذا نطقها ترجمان. ترجمان. الأصل في الكلمة هي كلمة فينيقية وكانت ثلاثية تعني رجم وتعني قال، وبهذا المعنى جاءت في القرآن في قصة رجما بالغيب. يقولون ثلاثة يقولون رجما بالغيب أي قولا بالغيب. ومن هنا أيضا جاءت أو لها علاقة برجم بشيء، لأن الشياطين عندما كانوا يصعدون ليسترقوا السماء كانت لهم الكلمات والتسابيح كانت لهم رجوم. إذن فهذه هي المعاني. ثم انتقلت إلى اللغة الفرنسية تروشما باغ تروشما بواسطة كذا. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا. Dimitri, I think you're about to comment on the jokes question. Please.
Well, obviously, I don't know the Italian of Carly's days, but scherzo might also mean affectation in the sense of note. So that's so he then will be referring to the notes.
Notes. Okay. Thank you.
As affectations.
Sorry, Peter first, and then please.
Yes. So إلى الأستاذ شغلان أقول غاية الاشتكاك في علم الاشتقاق. يعني we will never know whether etymology is always right or not. But that's just a small comment. Maryam, many thanks for your fascinating talk. I want to play devil's advocate. I hope you will forgive me for that. I have like a little personal stake in this, in that I'm very familiar with Neil Palabiek's scholarship and what she has argued over, and you were in her panel, I think it was in Toronto, over the last few years, is basically that the serious interest in Ottoman studies does not start in the late 17th or early 18th century, but earlier with humanists like Holius and others. Like you mentioned Scaliger, he didn't get very far in his study of Turkish, but basically what happens with the dragomans and at the port is very different from the scholarly interest. So if you compare like what Carly does to what Scaliger does, you're in a completely different universe, and therefore your conclusion. So I want to press you on this. Your conclusion that this is either the end of the humanist scholarship or the beginning of the Enlightenment. I think it's neither, because the serious interest in literature. So Holius, for instance, I mean, he studied, you know, like literature, poetry, all these things in Turkish. You know, he had a great interest, as did others. We're talking about jokes here. You know, like Raphaelengius, for instance, translated Hodja tales and so on and so forth. So there's all this happens, you know, like maybe like 70 to 100 years earlier, and it's a serious endeavor to engage with the intellectual tradition, whereas the Dragomans and what they do, that is, and also the popular literature, you know, like that's something different. The pamphlets, if you see what I mean. So that's just like I would love your comment on that.
No, thank you. I really appreciate the comment, and I hope I didn't come across too strongly by suggesting that no one before Carly studied the Ottomans in their own terms. I think what I'm getting at really is like the scholarship of the mid and earlier 17th century. Of like Arabic and Persian and Turkish, and especially the work on proverbs and the popular literature, as you suggest. I haven't come across many, maybe this is just my own ignorance, and because it's a topic of interest of mine. I feel like those works aren't presented as, here's an Ottoman author and their work start to finish, here you go, like, you know, interpret it and read it in the way you want.
What about the Rose Garden, for instance?
What do you mean?
Like, what's his name? Like our colleague at Princeton, his name is on the tip of my tongue. He worked on.
Babinski, yeah, Paul.
Yeah, Paul Babinski,
yeah.
So like he's recently finished his PhD and.
Sadi's Rose Garden. Yeah. It's just the beginnings for sure. Yeah.
From start to finish. I mean, the Hodja tales that Raphaelengius translated into Latin and Italian. That's also from start to finish. So there's, and I could give other examples.
So I think one way to, Paul is a dear friend, and I'm not suggesting at all that that is not a precursor to Carly. I think what I'm getting at is that there's something in Carly's statement about wanting to show the erudition, and there's something about erudition here that is distinct from the Hodja tales or the poetry or aphorisms or adages that we do see translated, which are, in my opinion, a little bit of an extension of the ethnographic kind of study of the Ottomans. But I'm figuring this out. I really appreciate the comment, and I should develop it much further than I have. But I think this like the subject of presenting Kātip Çelebi's erudition as opposed to Turkish literature in the way that we see preceding him, I think there's something there, but I'm not sure. I'm figuring it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Well, thank you. Well, my comment is related to the first two speakers, Professor Gutas and Nicolaidis. We appreciate very much the width of the presentation, and we understand that Professor Gutas is about a new project which brings East and West together, and we are looking forward to that. As my question to my dear friend Efthymios Nicolaidis is about the first part of his speech when he spoke about early transmissions of Islamic or Persian or Arabic, whatever the case is, astronomy to Byzantium. What are the sources of these studies? The codexes where they are kept. We know that after the conquest of Istanbul, certain manuscripts were taken to the Vatican and they kept there, etc. But for the earlier period, where are the manuscripts, the codexes you spoke about?
Thank you, Professor Stanglu, and I thank you also to having put me in contact with the foundation and this meeting. The manuscripts I spoke are in European libraries. When the Crusaders conquered Constantinople in 1204, they brought most of the manuscript to the West. The manuscript was of very great value anyway. So some manuscripts at that period were brought by the Byzantines who fled the town. Some others, they were to be found in other towns like Thessalonica, etc. The situation today is that the main corpus of the manuscripts is to be found in Vatican, the Vaticana, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, in London, and also in Austria and in some other European libraries. There is a very small number of manuscripts in Istanbul. During the Ottoman period, the Topkapi manuscripts diminished more and more. They were maybe bought by Western Europeans. And I must say that also there is an important corpus of manuscripts in the Mount Athos. And the National Language Research Foundation has, for many years now, many projects to make the catalog of these manuscripts, and the catalogs are going on. Fortunately, as Professor Gutas said, last years, many of the manuscripts of the Western European libraries are online, and more of these manuscripts can be found now online. So we can study all those manuscripts who are not yet have been edited.
Thank you. We have a question over there, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Professor Gutas mentioned how connected the known world was during Alexander's expansion of his empire towards Central Asia. Alexander invaded Bactria and Arachosia in 329 BC, what is now Afghanistan. And well before that, during Darius, there was more connectivity or similar connectivity. But we are ignoring the destruction these expansions brought to the regions they invaded. So they destroyed whatever knowledge or culture there was before building new institutions to create culture or to produce knowledge. Another point that I wanted to make earlier was about China. Translations from Chinese text to Arabic and vice versa. So that is also something that we need to keep in mind for the future. But the point is that the manuscript that we see in most European libraries and institutions were somehow stolen by different invasions, through different invasions and empires. So there's another aspect that we need to keep in mind when exploring connectivity and understanding between different cultures. In a way, they are better preserved here, because in some countries, if these manuscripts were there, we would not have found them anyway, but it is a dilemma.
So this is a question for Professor Gutas? Yes. Dimitri, if you'd like to comment.
Yes. I don't know what the question really is. The thing is that before Alexander, I am not aware, I don't really know whether there were any translations of Chinese material into whatever languages. Certainly not to Greek, and certainly not to Aramaic, let's say, before, or Persian. There may have been, but I doubt it. I never heard of anything of that sort. So, and after Islam, there certainly were no translations. There may be an occasional translation by some scholars or other, but those are not really significant historically speaking. There was only one translation of an Arabic text into Chinese, I think, mathematical text at some point. I forget the precise time, but again, that is just a unique example of that. So overall, there is no entrance of any Chinese or even more Eastern than that material into the historical West, basically from Afghanistan, from Bactria to the Atlantic. The same thing applies, of course, to India. And from India, there was some material before Islam that went into Middle Persian, most notably, obviously, Kalila Wadimna, and these things also, of course, are some astronomical materials that later passed also, of course, into Arabic and thence into the West. But for the most part, as we know also from Biruni's great book on India, there was no widespread entrance of Sanskrit materials into that, as I said, except for some astronomical material that entered via Middle Persian into Arabic, etc. So, as I said, the documentation that I know, that doesn't. So, by Alexander the Great, what I mean is that by whatever there was any destruction of previous materials there, I don't know. May well have been, may not have been. That's not the issue. The issue is that, politically speaking, what Alexander did, and later on his successors, and then, of course, with the Roman Empire later on extending itself to the Atlantic from Italy, then you have as I said, the geopolitical area which saw itself even as a one particular area. There were different religions that developed here everywhere, but even so, if we take into consideration that the religions in this area were all from the Abrahamic tradition, in a sense, that is again a point of connectedness between that, from which Indian civilization and Chinese civilization remained outside. So that is why I called this area from Central Asia to the Atlantic the historical West, in a sense, within which we have the West of the West and the East of the West, of course, what we now call East and West. But for the historical period and until the Renaissance, culturally speaking, that area was quite unified in that regard, as we see, as I said, from the documentation type.
Quick follow-up. Yeah, please, Peter.
Dimitri, there's a guy called Rashid ad-Din, 13th century. Basically, they're Persian so there's the Chinese Persian translation of medical material that then gets translated into Arabic. It doesn't have a huge impact on the Arabic tradition, but there's some Chinese material.
Later. Yeah, later. There's a question at the back first, and then here. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentations. Do we know what percentage of these translations were scientific or cultural, or do we have any breakdown? And that's one question. And then another thing is, as the Western civilization moves sort of center right, so to speak, is there, and we know there is an acceptance that the Arab Muslim civilization contributed towards, the translation movement, but is there some sort of a renewed denial at the moment, or is there some sort of distancing that's happening? I get a sense there's sort of, okay, fine, these guys translated, we may owe them something or not, we don't really care, where are we going forward? So 2 questions, please. Thank you.
Dimitri,
no, the percentage, no, the material that was translated, by and large, as I said, the one that was influential that was translated was primarily scientific. And by scientific, I mean, of course, what we also call philosophy. Philosophy, if we look at, either what Aristotle, so to speak, classifies under the different areas of philosophy. And later on, if we look basically at the Shifa of Ibn Sina, in a sense, philosophy includes everything, all knowledge, so to speak, which is, of course, logic. And then you have the physical sciences, which begin with physics, and then and then you go down the meteorology, and you go down to humans, you go to animals and plants, and then you go, of course, to the mathematical sciences, astronomy, music, etc., and of course, metaphysics. So these were all the sciences, in a sense. So we tend to call philosophy now the more, I don't know, deep ideas about things or whatever. But historically speaking, philosophy was science, and science was philosophy as we understand it. That was the material that was transmitted. What was transmitted here and there, and depending, of course, on the situation, was there was no really literary material translated. That's all. Even Homer does not seem to have been translated into Arabic. Syriac, there may have been some. Historical works, not other than chronographies that we find. That's where, of course, Kātip Çelebi gets his information from these chronographies, from pre-Islamic and later Islamic chronographies. So the material was primarily scientific from that point of view. As for the second question about the distancing, no, I think now it's pretty well understood basically about this process of translations, from which the Arabic translations were, of course, as I said, the nodal point, because the previous translations converged. So you have from Syriac and Middle Persian, they get into Arabic, and then from Arabic you get, of course, then later on to Latin and Hebrew and Greek. But overall, I think this is by now pretty much acknowledged. There have been about 20 years ago or whatever, some issue about a French scholar who doubted that there was any influence on Europe by the translations from Arabic, etc. And he said, no, it was all done from translations from the Greek, etc., because the Arabs could not really translate high thoughts into Arabic. It's not a language that's fit for, and nonsense like that. So, that kind of thing, of course, you do find on occasion, but not seriously. I don't think there's an issue anymore.
Thank you. Question here, please. Quick one, please. Yeah.
Two comments, Dr. Gutas. First of all, you mentioned about the Chinese and translations. I think there was a bit of translation from Chinese because there was a substantial missionary, Nestorian ministry in China, and there was a lot of Aramaic prescription in China. So there will be some translation from Chinese to Aramaic. So that's just a comment in general. But I want to ask you about your sheet. In your right side, you mentioned there was a translation A alpha and translation beta, and you put a timeline around 9th century, which is exactly the same as Hananian school. And then you said it's Latin to Greek. My understanding is that there is a Greek to Latin translation at the 9th century, the same time as the Hananian school?
No. The translation into Latin is by Merbeki in the 13th century.
So, but what is this alpha and beta?
Transliteration is not, I'm sorry. The transliteration alpha, beta, and gamma, this is transliteration from capital letters to lowercase, to minuscule letters. In antiquity, Greek was written in capital letters, and around the 7th, 8th century, they started transcribing the manuscripts into lowercase, into minuscule letters. And that is important, making the schemata, because mistakes that are made during this transition from capital to minuscule can show in the manuscripts, and which manuscript is related to which on the basis of those mistakes. So it is important to indicate the transliterations. Sorry, that was the transmission on the Greek side.
Can I make a very quick question about this? Sorry?
Can واحدة فجواب إتمام.
Okay, please.
فيما يتعلق بسؤال هل أثرت الحضارة العربية الإسلامية فعلا في الغرب أم لا؟ هناك دليل قاطع على ذلك. نعلم أن أصول الحضارة الغربية كلها انتقلت من إيطاليا. لماذا انتقلت من إيطاليا بالضبط؟ لأن جل العلوم العربية الإسلامية كانت هناك بفضل بعض فريدريك الثاني الذي حارب البابا بشكل من الأشكال وحاربه بترجمة العلوم وبإرسال كثير من الفلاسفة لترجمة هذه العلوم، وكذلك الرجل لما ترجم يعني الجغرافيا إلى. فهناك أدلة الآن وهناك كتابات تدل على أن أسافي الحضارة الغربية هي العلوم العربية، بما في ذلك مثلا حتى في اللغة خذ كلمة يوربانيزم بالفرنسية كيف تنطق بالإنجليزية، يعني العمران، بناء العمران، urbanization. فهي هذه يوربان هي عمران، يعني بناء المدن. فكثير ثم هناك إذا ترجع الآن إلى سواء المعاجم الفرنسية أو المعاجم الإنجليزية أو حتى المعاجم الألمانية ستجد كثيرا من الآثار التي تدل على أن هذه العلوم العربية انتقلت منذ القديم يعني في الثقافات وفي الحضارة الغربية.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the three speakers. Thank you very much.